Okay, now we've talked about referencing. We now understand that NIEM has some ways to link objects together, right? You can have an association that links some objects together. You can have an object that plays a role, and the role points to the object, and that links them together. And you could have multiple roles for the object. So we've done the referencing stuff. Now we're down to a grab bag of 4 different topics. They're not really related in the same way as the referencing stuff is. So this is a grab bag, but we're going to talk about code tables. We're going to talk about metadata. We're going to talk about augmentations, and we're going to talk about using external standards within NIEM. So that'll be the rest of our technical topics. Just hang tight for those. Okay, so now we've looked at NIEM's use of referencing. We've seen it both in terms of associations and in terms of doing roles, where we have items that point to each other using built-in referencing. But we also know we can just include things inside if we don't feel like doing the referencing, if the referencing doesn't meet our needs. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about code tables. So code tables are really important. We're only mapping one thing, but it's an incredibly important topic because codes help ensure accurate information. You've got a code table, and how do you want to just take something simple as gray. My hair isn't gray. My wife tells me my hair is going gray. I just think it's going extra blonde. But my wife has very, very dark brown hair, and when her hairs go gray, they turn bright silver. The bright silver is just gorgeous. Bright silvery gray hair. And how do you represent that? If I'm going to send you that information, do you spell it American style, G-R-A-Y? Do you spell it English style, UK English style, G-R-E-Y? And both spellings are frequently used in the United States, even though the A-Y I think is the more widely used. Both are still widely used. So what do? Do you want to have to check for alternate spellings? No, what you want to have is a single code table for the color gray. This is the code we use. Code tables ensure accurate information by constraining what information you can send, by having a way to check and say, hey, this was not one of the valid codes. So codes are really essential for accurate information sharing, and that's what NIEM is all about. So NIEM has tons of code tables, and we're going to do a severity code for this injury as an example. Codes are essentially strings. They're just simple data. Now, they're not always strings, but most of the code tables in NIEM are short strings. Some of them are integers. So there are code tables where all the codes are numbers. And then we just use integer for that, because that gives us just a little extra bit of error checking there. But they're just essentially simple data strings. There are also a few that are patterns. They're defined patterns. There's a code table. It's a code. Instead of being actually a table of codes, it's a pattern the codes have to match. We're not going to cover those. They're fairly esoteric in NIEM, and they're only in a couple of domains. So we're not going to focus on those. Just know that they're there. In general, elements in NIEM are defined in their domains, but the types for those elements are often defined in a namespace for the type. This is important. We put the type definitions in separate namespaces organized by authoritative source for the code tables. That separates the element that's going to hold the code from the type that defines the code. That lets us redefine the code table without changing the element. So we can redefine code tables, we can add new codes to a code table without actually changing a domain and without having to ever change NIEM core, because the definitions of the code tables are in a different namespace. And they're organized by authoritative source, so that an authoritative source can monitor those and update them themselves without touching the domain that's using the code table. In NIEM, even though this is simple data, we wrap them in a complex type to add infrastructure attributes, which we've already seen. We've already seen those. We're going to see them later too. We still have one more use for referencing when we get to metadata. So that we'll see that in the next section. But we've already seen it in terms of associations and roles. We've seen the infrastructure attributes, and those apply to code table entries as well. So code tables can have IDs, so other things can point to them. And that becomes very important when we talk about metadata. So we need to go find out about this and see see what it looks like. So instead of just going right to it, let's go back and look at the crash person we were dealing with. So we need a severity code for that injury. Well, maybe it has one. Here's crash person injury. And let's go to the SSGT as well. It's good to look at them in both. Crash person injury, we can go to that. So, crash person injury, of injury type. What does injury type hold? It holds an injury severity abstract. Awesome, that's great. What can that be replaced with? A text version and a code version. So remember when I talked about my eye color? And I said, sometimes you want to use a code, but sometimes you need a text version. You don't want to be constrained by the code. And that happens pretty much every code table, and NIEM does it this way. There's a code version, there's a text version. You use the code when you want to be able to constrain the values and you're happy with the codes in the table. You use the text version when you don't want to restrain the codes or when you don't like the codes in the code table. And you can also make your own code table. If I needed to make my own injury severity code table because I don't like the codes in the existing one, I could do that. I could make a new code table and just give it a substitution group head of injury severity abstract. And there I've made a new code that fits in with the existing code table and with the text version. But before we make a choice like that, we should probably look at what's in the code table for injury severity code. Wayfair is better at this than the SSGT. So let's do the SSGT first. So injury severity code, click on it. I see its type is accident severity code type. I click on that. I see that's based on an accident severity code simple type. I click on that, and that gets me the code table. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 9. This is a common pattern you'll see in code tables, not just in NIEM. This is actually in these sorts of code tables where they're numbered, and then there's a skip to 9, or a skip if there's more than 10 of them. So like 1 through 13, then it skips to 99. The reason being that then they can add additional codes and still keep unknown as the last code and have it show up at the end of the list in like a drop down. So it's a convention you see a lot. If you're in Wayfair instead, here's the code. Wayfair does this, that's the location, sorry. Severity code is under S for severity. Here's the text version. Here's the code version. Wayfair does the replacement for the abstract group head. That's just different philosophies on how to show it. If I click on the severity code, Wayfair knows right away this is a code table and offers to let me go and see the code table for the type that this is all based on. And there's the same code table as you saw in the SSGT, exact same information. So if we're happy with that, we would just use this code table. And I'm happy with it, so that's the one we're going to use. So back to our notes. So that was our example, injury severity code. We found it fairly easily. We just looked inside that crash person injury that we found in the prior step, and that got us right to, hey, there's a severity code. We know that there's a text version and a code version. We're going to use the code version because this is the section on code tables, but also because it's good to constrain things when you can. It's good to have that. And what's great about an XML editor is an XML editor will check that value for you. If you put an invalid value in there, it'll complain, it'll tell you. If you put 12 in for the severity code, it'll say 12 is not one of the allowed values for that severity code. So very important stuff to do. Anything in NIEM that ends in the word code, that is a code table. Again, that's a representation term. We've seen it a few times now. We've seen it with things that end in text, and we know that means they're a string. We've seen it where they end in indicator, and that means they're a Boolean. Now we're seeing it where they end in code, and that represents that it's going to be a code table. And they nearly always have a text alternative. So whatever there's blah, blah, blah code, there's also going to be a blah, blah, blah text for when you want a free-form text value for it. The way it works in schema is a little bit convoluted, and NIEM 6 will be simpler. Here's injury severity code. So we're making an element called injury severity code. It's got a type of accident severity code type, which has a prefix AMVA_D20. Now, I don't know what the D20 stands for, but I know what the AMVA stands for. It stands for the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, or maybe administration. Well, I know 4/5 of what AMVA stands for. And AMVA is responsible for pretty much all the traffic and crash related data in the justice domain, but they also maintain several code tables that have to do with motor vehicle stuff, including an accident severity code. So they are the authoritative source for this one code table. Now, that doesn't mean they're an authoritative source for all the code tables in NIEM. That's not their job. They are an authoritative source, though, for many motor vehicle-oriented code tables. And so they have a separate namespace in NIEM with their own schema. And in that schema, these code tables are defined. Then the elements that use them are back in the domain. So this injury severity code here, this is in the justice domain, but the definition of the code table is in the AMVA namespace. It's a code table namespace. It doesn't have elements in it. All it has is types defining code tables. You know it has a substitution group head of injury severity abstract that lets it replace injury severity abstract, but you could also replace injury severity abstract with the text version of injury severity. Now when it comes to defining the actual codes, and we're moving into the AMVA namespace now, it's a two-step process, which is a little clunky, but it's just the way we do it now. It will be cleaned up for NIEM 6, but we've done it this way for 15 years, and it works. It's just one step clunkier than it needs to be. The first thing you do is define the codes. And we do that with something called whatever code simple type, in this case, accident severity code simple type. Instead of extending from something, it's a restriction. It starts with a base, in this case token, and it restricts it to certain enumerations. So this first enumeration here is the value 1. So this is the code. The value is the code. What the code stands for is here in the documentation tag. So 1 stands for fatal accident. 2 is the code for an incapacitating injury accident. 3 for a non-incapacitating, and so on. You may wonder what token is. Well, token is a string with the white space removed from the beginning and end. The reason for that is simple. Let me drop into source mode here for a second and show you the source behind this, because I can actually edit that. Here's this documentation tag, ending documentation tag. What's the value of the documentation? Fatal accident. XML is perfectly fine with formatting it like that. Perfectly fine. Now what is technically the value of documentation? It is carriage return 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tabs, carriage return 4 more tabs. That's the actual string in between the documentation start and the documentation ending tag. Return 5 tabs, fatal accident, return 4 more tabs. If you're trying to match that against something, it's not going to match. It's not going to match the string fatal accident. This is fine XML, but it will cause problems when you're trying to actually do string matching. So token strips that white space off. In the token version, that was just the string fatal accident. No matter how the wrapping was, no matter how the white space was, no matter how the indenting was, strips all that off, leaving you with just fatal accident. So that's why the code tables are token, because that makes the validator able to then look at it and do meaningful comparisons against these enumerations. It's just to make it easier from XML schema to actually check these codes. Otherwise, it's just a string. So we make all these codes, and that is the end of the simple type. And now we have a code table. But it's missing something. It's missing those infrastructure attributes. Right now, you couldn't put an ID on this. And we want to be able to do that. So what NIEM does is wraps it in a complex type. It says, now we had that accident severity code simple type. That's our base. We make a new type without the word simple. And all we do is add a simple object attribute group to it. And what's in that attribute group? That adds in ID and ref and metadata so that a code table element can have an ID, can reference something else, and most importantly, can reference metadata. Again, we haven't talked about metadata. I think that's the very next topic. Very important, though, for individual pieces of data as well as for larger objects. So this is how we make these things in NIEM. We make a simple type that defines the codes, and then we make a complex type to add these attributes, because you can't do that in XML schema at a simple type level. What we're going to do probably, I can't guarantee it, but in NIEM 6, you'll just start at the complex type. You won't do the simple type thing. You'll just start with a complex type and work from there. The only real benefit of doing this two-stage approach is that those simple types can be unioned together. So you can take two code tables and group them together in a union. There's one domain that does that extensively, so you'll still be able to do it that way, but for the vast majority of cases, it just would be easier to just start with a complex type. So that is probably what NIEM 6 will do. So this is a little clunky, a little kludgy. It works. You get used to it, honestly, but it will get better, I think, in the next major version of NIEM. The instance document for it looks like this. Crash person injury. It's got an injury severity code, in this case 3, end of the code and end of the injury. If I put 12 in there, a validating XML editor would complain. They would say, hey, injury severity code is set to have the numbers 1 through 5 or 6, I forget which one, 1 through 5 or 6, and then 9. If it's not one of those codes, then it's an error. If it's one of those codes, 3 is, then it's fine. In JSON, looks the same, crash person injury, severity code, get a value of 3, but because we don't support JSON schema yet, there's no way to validate it. So there's no way to check right now that that's a valid code in a JSON. It's just a limitation of how we do JSON right now. So we did that mapping. We found our injury severity code, and we learned about how code tables work. Let's look at our artifacts. We just added one thing. We just added the injury severity code under the crash person injury, but it was easy to find and easy to map. The mapping spreadsheet is similarly terse. We've got our injury severity code, but because it's NIEM, and that is a way of representing the abstract concept of injury severity, we have to get the injury severity abstract in there as well. So we have to add another line to the spreadsheet. Got our type here. The abstract is inside crash person injury, and the code gets substituted for the abstract. We got our definitions. And we have our exchange path. And so you see these things keep building. The actual code is in crash. So you got a crash. Inside that is a crash person. Inside that is a crash person injury. Inside that is the injury severity abstract, but that gets substituted for the injury severity code. So we get our whole we get our whole path map there. Let's go back to our notes.